All right, now that we're recording, let's kick off. We still have people joining. We'll let people filter in. I'm going to hand the reins over to Hannah in just a moment, but welcome to the fifth Enduring Planeteer, Mark One and Friends community event. We do one of these every month. Next month's event will be in person at San Francisco Climate Week. It will be a 300-person summit on the waterfront, talking about all things finance. So if you want to sign up and join, I just dropped a link. Can't guarantee everyone a slot. It's like selection by committee. You know, sign up now and you'll know about it in a couple weeks before the event. But okay, I'll hand it over to Hannah to set the scene, and then we'll do speaker intros and we'll get to it.
Wonderful. Always such a privilege to join this room. I encourage everybody today to jump in the chat with questions in real time. I'll weave those into the conversation as usual. And for the folks who've been giving feedback to these community events, it is so meaningful and helpful. We'll take everything from "we loved it," from "Hannah put her foot in her mouth 10 times," to also "here's what I want to hear next," and "here's where we've still continue to find challenges or get conflicting advice." All of that helps us improve this content to make it more helpful for you all. So please, before and after the event, to Dimitri and I's emails, to our LinkedIn's, wherever it's most helpful for you, please send along that feedback. We've been getting a lot of great validation that this is valuable. What better way to translate the legal landscape into really actionable, tangible evidence with Yael from Auric and Sonam from Street Life, and of course the wonderful Dimitri of Enduring Planet. Excited for you all to give introductions, but of course, when we talk about the legal intricacies of not only starting your climate company, but of contracting customers to financing over time, it's hard not to think about all of the different examples where contracts have gone poorly. And we read this in the news where offtakes are being rescinded or reneged on, where venture debt agreements are being kind of pulled out from, literally cash swept out of accounts from different, venture-backed companies at different times. And when you think about like how to prevent what goes wrong, it's always easy to gloss over those long contracts in the process of signing them, but almost always you come back to them at least once in the process of operationalizing and growing the business, and who sits on the other side is only even more important. So representing legal today, representing your lenders today, and representing your equity investors, we have a great smattering. With that, Yael, would you like to start off? We'll go to Dimitri next, and then to Sonam.
Sure, happy to kick it off. Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for joining. My name is Yael Pearl. I'm a partner at Auric. I'm part of our technology companies group. I work with early to late stage startups, and I also work with venture capital funds. On the startup side, everything from formation through the life cycle of, financings, day-to-day sort of outside GC kind of work, and then, hopefully to a successful sale or IPO. So I do all of that. And then on the investor side, help investors navigate financing into companies, including diligence, negotiating documents, and all that fun stuff. I'm based in Silicon Valley. I do a lot of my work with climate tech startups. I co-head our climate tech group, which is basically everything, coming at the climate problem through new technologies. Happy to be here today, and thanks again.
Welcome, Dimitri.
Yeah, and I'll actually, Sonam, do you want to go next? Because I have a little anecdote I want to share, and I don't want to throw off the flow. So do you want to introduce yourself?
She is frozen for me. For you too?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
She looks very regal. So while we wait for Sonam, Dimitri, bring us your anecdote.
Yeah, I'll give the sort of anecdote. So I'm Dimitri. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Enduring Planet. We kind of have this fun reality that we exist in, which is that we're both a venture-backed startup and an investor in the climate space. So we provide working capital financing to climate companies, primarily where we lend against government contract receivables. So if you have a government contract, you need some working capital, we can provide you funding against that contract. We also provide fractional CFO services to climate companies. So we do everything from accounting to modeling to dashboards to KPI reporting, and pretty much all of the finance back office we can handle for climate companies today. And part of the reason that I wanted to organize this event with Oric is because we have learned a lot of really hard lessons on the legal front building this business. Not because like we operate in a particularly complex compliance environment, although we do, but because we've had bad legal in the past. And you don't really know you have bad legal until you get good legal. And then your good legal figures out what all the bad legal did in the past. And so I'll just give you an example. So we launched our company. We found lawyers that had sector expertise in exactly the thing we were building really quickly. We raised our pre-seed round. They helped us draft a bunch of docs and sort of get everything together and help with compliance. And then we had to find new lawyers for our fund that we were setting up because our existing attorneys didn't have the right mix of skills. And when we engaged this new firm, they did a quick deep dive on our past legal work. And they were like, hey, you guys didn't do anything to paper your pre-seed round when it was done. You don't have any of the relevant consents. You didn't file notices with states where you raised money, which are called blue sky notices. Like none of it got done. And we had to retroactively paper it. We paid some fees places, and it was this whole mess. And so that for me was like a really big, and I'm like, I think of myself as someone who really understands these things. And the fact that even I got caught in this trap was a really big eye opener for me. And so we give a lot of, we help a lot of our companies think through these questions and get good counsel. And then the last thing I'll say is, by the way, nothing that we say here should be construed as legal advice. This is not legal advice. Don't take the word of anything we say here as legal advice. This is just a dialogue about things that are legal. Get a good attorney.
Like
Oric. And ask them for legal advice. Yeah.
Yes. Brilliant.
Thank you for adding that disclaimer. Appreciate it. As a lawyer.
Yep. Of course. All right. And then Sonam, you're back. So do you want to give your intro?
Yes. Sorry. I am going to try to log back on from my computer once it restarts, but joining from my iPad for now. Hi, everyone. I'm Sonam Villani. I am the co-founder and managing partner of an early stage venture fund called Street Life. We invest at the intersection of cities and climate. For us, that means everything from the built environment and urban infrastructure, and we partner with cities, infrastructure groups, and real estate firms to help early stage companies deploy their products, either in the physicality of the built environment or through technology systems if they're software companies. We also help them navigate the regulatory environment, think about how to operate unit economics positive businesses in the complexity of the built environment and urban spaces, and how to actually structure their capital stack, leveraging venture, we fundamentally believe, as one tool in the toolkit of all of the different financing solutions you can bring to the table. Of course, all of that has legal implications, which we'll get into shortly. My own background, I've spent my entire career in climate, started in infrastructure finance, so financing large transportation systems, water systems, energy systems, worked at the World Bank, as well on building infrastructure all over Asia, and then was at the mayor's office at City Hall in New York and helped lead the development of New York City's climate plan, and then was at an early stage startup called Zipline, now a very large startup called Zipline, which uses drones to deliver life-saving medicine. And particularly, they leveraged a lot of non-dilutive capital to fuel that growth and set up lots of creative partnerships with different stakeholders across the ecosystem to build on that success. So happy to talk about all of that, and I will try again to sign on from my computer shortly.
Wonderful. This is such a rich conversation because across all of these different personas that you're wearing in your past lives, you've also seen the good, bad, and ugly of starting things, launching funds, you know, being on the insides of these companies, and Yale, your experiences across a wide volume of these types of contracts and structures is so rich. Thank you all for joining today. We're gonna tackle this conversation in kind of three broad buckets. Structuring, which is like upfront and out of the gates. What are some of the watch outs? What are some of the long-term implications? And to Dimitri's point, how do sometimes the decisions you make at day one really have a long feedback cycle until you know how they play out in the long term? We're going to talk about financing as a broad spectrum of, you know, do's and don'ts and what those typical processes look like and the nature of those, some of those agreements. And then we're going to talk about kind of other contracts, right? These can be partnership contracts, these can be customer contracts, and how teethy should teethy really be for the nature of them. And we'll get into some of Dimitri and Sonam's operating experiences as well. Maybe to start then, I wanna talk about formation, right? There's a couple different ways that some of the founders in this room are, you know, many of you have made these decisions, but some of the founders in this room are thinking about, well, why should I be a B Corp? What's a public benefit corporation? How should I think about an LLC versus a C Corp in thinking about the long-term trajectory of your climate venture or fund, although that's a little different. So for an operating company or a startup, Yael, I'd love to hear from you a little bit about the 101s on each of these, their differences, and the broad strokes for how folks can think about the trade-offs as they get out of the gates.
Sounds good. So yeah, and I'll keep this pretty basic, just to level set with everyone. I know there's kind of people in different stages of their kind of careers, if it's a first-time founder or repeat founder, or if you're a fund, so kind of different views on all this. So I'll keep it basic, but any more kind of complex questions, feel free to post those in the chat and we can kind of respond to them at the right time. So just to start out, so there's a lot of considerations and I could probably go on for an hour roughly. But when you're thinking about forming a company, you know, the question really is, what type of business are you looking to create? And these are the kinds of conversations that you'll have with your attorneys. Basically, once you've decided you're ready to pull the trigger and form that company, it's a good idea to find counsel, good counsel that you've gotten recommendations on and you connect with, and that has, you know, worked in your specific space repeatedly. And there's no right answer to how to form a company. It really depends on the kind of business that you're forming. Generally, though, I'll say if you're looking to be a VC-backed company, you're going to want to be typically, and this is, I'm saying what is like plain vanilla company, is a Delaware C Corp, okay? That is the easiest for investors to digest. They prefer to invest in a Delaware C Corp because that is what, you know, 99% of the companies they work with are. And there's various sort of reasons on the tax side and on the regulatory side for why that is. But just to give you a sense of, so that's maybe to level set again, Delaware C Corp is the most plain vanilla of all the structures and generally what most founders go with when they want to have a venture-backed company. Different other types of different formations could be an LLC, which is a limited liability company. Generally is not a corporation. It is a pass-through entity for tax purposes, and entirely different rules apply to an LLC than to a corporation.
Sorry to interrupt, but can you define what does pass-through mean in this context?
That means that generally it's not taxed at the entity level. So a corporation is taxed as a corporation on its, you know, any revenue that it has. A pass-through means that taxation passes through to the members of the LLC. So they there's a direct sort of taxation, like the entity is disregarded for purposes of taxation, not for things of like limitation of liability, which does exist with an LLC, but not for purposes of taxation. So that's something to think about. Venture capital funds generally do not want to invest in LLCs. They can't, right? They don't have the mandate to do that. They do not want to be responsible as sort of members directly. They don't want their LPs to be taxed directly. So all of that, when you think again about VC financing, you want to go with a Delaware, with a C Corp, probably Delaware. And that's one other thing to think about is, there's been a lot in the press lately about whether or not, Delaware is still the right place. We have an article on ORIC's website and our Tech Studio website about considerations about whether or not you should stay within Delaware or go to Nevada or Texas, kind of those hotter jurisdictions right now within the US. The short answer in my mind, and I want to keep it short, but happy to take kind of complex questions later, is the answer is still stick with Delaware. So the legislation is fast and efficient. The case law is clear, and it's and again most commonly known and most efficient. So if you are, however, starting a startup that has sort of bespoke terms and specific investors that really are allergic to for some reason to Delaware, then sure, you can absolutely form in other jurisdictions, and most attorneys would be happy to help you go with California, go with Nevada, go with Texas, or any other location you want. But you have to understand the costs for formation in those jurisdictions and enforcement and all the other things. It's just going to be a little bit more complicated and more expensive because it's not the plain vanilla. And it's not off the shelf in terms of formation, right? And if you want to go quickly on day one, you don't want to deal with legal, you don't have the funds to do that either, then the easiest, fastest way is Delaware. So unless there are any other questions on this, I'll touch a little bit on sort of public benefit corporations and B Corps, if that's helpful. And then I'll open for any other folks on the panel who have questions or want to talk about this. But just to give you a sense, so standard Delaware corporation, this is true generally for corporations in other jurisdictions. The board, and generally the purpose of the company is to maximize benefits for its stockholders as a whole, whether it's the founders who are putting in, sweat equity by, working for the company and putting their IP in, or it's actually equity, the investors, right, who are coming in and investing cash into the company. So the board has fiduciary duties to the stockholders as a whole to make sure that basically we're maximizing profits for them. Okay, so that's the goal of a corporation, and that's the standard by which actions of the board and of management, the officers, will be looked at. But at some point in the recent history, folks realize we want to take other considerations into account that are not just maximizing stockholder benefit. For example, we want to think of the environment. We want to have other social considerations. We want to do something for the benefit of humankind. And that was to some degree in contrast with just maximizing stockholder wealth, right? So the concept of a public benefit corporation was created. It's a sort of a statutory entity in Delaware and in other jurisdictions. They have similar concepts where you can, in your charter, in the main governing documents of the company, designate sort of a benefit that's not just stockholder benefit, right? So it could be a greater social good. It could be the environment. It could be curing some sort of illness. So many types of public benefits could be designated. And the idea is that the board and management are allowed to take that into consideration, or should take that into consideration, and balance that with otherwise the stockholder benefit. Sorry.
Yeah, can we just talk quickly through some of the how quickly some of this stuff can move? So maybe Dimitri, give me an anecdote here. When you raised your pre-seed, were you a C Corp already in Delaware?
Yeah, I mean, I want to I want to comment on something that it was asked in chat, and then talk a little bit about formation as well from our experience. So one is, I think the best way to find a good lawyer is to ask your peers. I think that one of the biggest considerations early on is how much can you afford, and also whether or not the law firm you're working with is willing to defer or discount fees given how early you are. The larger the law firm, the more likely they are to be able to discount or defer fees, because they're like, hey, we're in this with you for the long haul. But we've also seen similar cases with small firms that are boutique, that sort of target your demographic. I would ask your fellow founders for who they like to have worked with. Also, not all lawyers at all firms are the same. So you could get an introduction to like a big law firm like Cooley, and people be like, oh, we had an incredible experience with Cooley. And then you have whoever you get saddled with at Cooley is like not good, right? So you want to be really intentional about who you pick and how you sort of interrogate and do your homework around lawyers. I think for formation, oftentimes people have a really hard time affording a law firm to support formation. And so there are tools out there to help make it easier, right? Like AngelList has a, form your company in like 5 minutes kind of thing. They form a Delaware C Corp. They have standard docs. It's all super cookie cutter. That has its downsides, right? Because the docs are cookie cutter, they're not customized to your business. You can't form a PBC through AngelList. You have to form a C Corp in Delaware. Like it's got limitations. But that is an option for folks who want to do it on the cheap. It's like very, very inexpensive. At Enduring Planet, we intentionally formed a public benefit corporation for exactly the reason that Yale suggested. We've never had an issue with VCs or investors being like, oh, you're a public benefit corporation, we won't fund you, right? I think that in general, it's a very light touch way to signal value alignment. It's not the same thing as a B Corp. Like becoming a certified B Corp is an incredibly complicated process. There's a lot of things, especially about our business model, that actually kind of make it impossible for us to become. Can you please
How are
mute?
you guys?
Oh, can you please mute?
Me too. I'm
Oh
good.
God, that's an AI.
Bit cold, but
I'm gonna remove. Give me one
yeah,
second.
I have one of those.
Thanks for mentioning
Okay. All right. Sorry about that, folks. So being a PBC, I think, is relatively easy. And I do think that for some investors, it actually is a really powerful signal of your value alignment. And so I don't know, Sonam, if you've seen folks react negatively to people being registered as PBCs, but I haven't.
No, not at all. And I couldn't agree more on the value alignment piece, right? I think even as a firm, we have certain, certain criteria that we look for in our companies, whether that be climate impact, diversity goals that we want to fulfill ourselves. And oftentimes when we're talking to our LPs, right, our investors, about some of our portfolio companies, one of which is registered as a PBC, it's actually a great talking point, right? Because people are in it for both the mission alignment, but also, oftentimes it's thinking about profit and mission, right? At the end of the day, right? For all of us need to be very successful companies to actually make an impact. But the PBC conversation often is very, very much so in a positive light than a negative one.
I think one thing that's also worth flagging in Yale, I'd love to sort of, I don't know if you've seen issues with this, but one of the reasons that a lot of folks will form companies in other states is because they're interested in taking advantage of local incentives. But my experience is that you could still register your company in Delaware. You then have a foreign entity registration in the state in which you operate, which you're going to need anyway. So this is a thing that a lot of folks don't do. They'll register in Delaware, but they'll have their office in California, and they never register a foreign entity there. And then when it comes time, it becomes a real big problem. So like make sure that you talk to attorneys about where you need to be registered outside of your domicile state. But that's another way to take advantage of local incentives. So you can still be domiciled in Delaware, but if your office is in Jersey, you register for an entity in Jersey, and then you can take advantage of whatever state incentives exist for venture-backed companies there. And Yale, I don't know if you've seen otherwise, but that's my impression.
That's entirely correct. So companies still prefer to have the formation structure be Delaware. Again, it's simpler, it's most known, and then they go with and register as a foreign corporation in any other states that they are. I should also say, and we didn't touch on this, but just to touch on the rest of the world for a minute, because we're kind of US centric, but to the extent, founders are based in another country and asking themselves like, hey, I'm in Israel, I'm in India, I'm in wherever, I'm in Paris. What kind of entity should I form? I would still say if you are intending to raise VC dollars in the US, if you are intending to have significant operations in the US, you should still consider Delaware as one of your top options. It increases the likelihood that your investment will be streamlined and simple. versus, having to maybe later have to flip your company from a, foreign into a US entity for certain investors that really want to invest only in US company or Delaware companies. So if you are it's very common to have a structure of a US holding or Delaware C Corp holding company that gets the investment from investors. And that's where all the founders and all the employees hold their equity. And then underneath that, you'll have a subsidiary that is local to whichever country you are, whichever country you have operations, and whatever country you have employees. That is a very similar or simple fact pattern as well that we see as well.
Yeah. Thanks for that commentary. And I do want to highlight that some of this stuff, none of this is like wholly static. You can save yourself a lot of time and headache by getting it right up front. But I'll highlight that for early stage venture investors, folks who invest on a convertible note or a safe or any of these kind of like paper instruments that aren't actually a stock purchase agreement. I don't know how you feel about this, Sonam, but in the past, I've been a pre-seed investor for over 7 years, and you absolutely can receive pre-seed capital in the spirit of efficiency while you are the owner of the LLC and the company is operating as an LLC, because technically it's not a pass-through yet, and because the safe holder is not an LLC member or owner. And instead, then you incorporate the company before the next qualified financing, or you incorporate as that converts to equity. And there's kind of a mutually agreed understanding, usually with your investor, that that is going to happen, in part because, as Yael noted, in venture investors, typically institutional investors, right? They cannot take on that tax liability. Like legally, by our own limited partner agreements, we are prescribed not to have that, because it can then roll up through to our limited partners. And that type of tax liability is something they're very sensitive about. Yael, have you seen companies go quickly from, a regular Delaware C Corp to a public benefit corporation, or is that transition a little bit more intensive if you want to add that kind of mission and charter into the company at a later point?
Yeah, I would say most companies that decide to go the PBC or public benefit corporation route will decide that on formation. So for the most part, it's super simple. The formation process for a PBC doesn't add a lot of complexity from a standard Delaware corporation. So you just have to designate that public benefit, have that in your charter. And beyond that, there's not much to do. If you decide to do it later, there's a little bit of paperwork that goes with it, a board and stockholder consent. You need 2/3 majority, I believe. And so it's a little bit more complex, but on the whole, if these are early days for the company and you've now decided to go through the change, again, not super complex. A lawyer can help you, set that up.
Yeah. B Corp is much more complex, also can be done at a later date. Dimitri, did you say you've gone through the B Corp process?
No, we actually we looked at it pretty extensively, but because most of our employees are overseas, we trip one of their requirements around like local employment and FTEs. So most of the folks that work at Enduring Planet are actually based in Pakistan, and because of how Pakistan employment law works, it's optimized for them to be contractors. But because we are disproportionately contractor based, it makes it really hard for us to get a B Corp status. And so we just haven't bothered. Yeah.
And just to touch on that, for those who are not familiar, so a B Corp is not a sort of statutory entity. It's a certification provided by an organization called B Labs. And it's not any sort of legal standing. It's just an indication that you've gone through a certification process, showing that you have a mission and showing that you comply with certain, rigorous standards for being a benefit corporation. So a B Corp separate from a public benefit corporation, two different things. You can be one and not the other. I think a lot of times B Corp asks that you consider becoming a PBC or a public benefit corporation. I'm not sure that it's required, but you can definitely be a public benefit corporation and never get the B Corp certification.
Right. Sonam, do you ever see like different parts of the decision tree when companies decide to go? Thanks for clarifying that, Yael. I realized we were talking about them synonymously in some way. So Sonam, when do you see folks often going for B Corp? I've often seen it as like, especially for consumer facing products, when they want to signal that to the market and help them make sales and indicate their commitments. How do you see that playing out differently?
Yeah, consumer facing products, and then another place where I've seen it is that the entity might have one portion of their business that is sort of profit generating and another portion that might have some sort of open source component or research component that is more widely used across the ecosystem. So they may actually register the entity, sort of the parent entity, as a standard C Corp, and then they might have a sub-entity that's a B Corp that's specifically for purposes of that research, right? And the B Corp entity is the one that is actually receiving occasionally grant dollars, which we'll probably talk about next. That's the context in which I've seen it used most often. And then Hannah, just one point you mentioned earlier on kind of your early days of a company and then switching over. One thing to keep in mind is oftentimes your early stage investors are utilizing sort of a tax benefit called QSBS, which basically is a qualified small business stock. It's a section of the tax code that provides us and our investors tax benefits for investing in such small and early stage companies, hoping that you all do very well over the course of time. But these have that company, at that time has to be registered as a domestic C Corp with assets of less than $50 million, right? And it's at the time of stock issuance and immediately afterwards that QSBS designation comes into place. So that just to keep things in mind, as you all transition and get bigger and kind of what the right time is for all those formation discussions.
Super helpful. Thanks, Sonam. Let's talk about how formation shows back up. So, Yael, I wonder if you could help us think through the typical watchouts that often come back up during exit that were actually a decision made on formation and how those play out.
And I would actually expand that, not just at exit, but I think this often comes up in like a fundraising round or a project financing. Like the gotchas show up whenever new money comes in the door. And I think we should talk about all of those.
That's absolutely right. So hopefully you're getting everything right on day one, but if you don't get it right, it's most likely that you will find that out as soon as you have an investor investing in sort of a priced round. So typically not for a convertible note or safe or anything like that. There's typically not much diligence involved in that, but in a priced round where you're selling preferred stock at a certain price, lawyers for the investors will look at all of your formation and all the other documents you've accumulated until the point of that financing and will let you know if you've made any mistakes. So that's definitely something you want to avoid. If you have, if those mistakes are fixable, they'll ask that you do that ahead of them investing. So that actually might delay you from closing, and you might have sort of covenants and money you have to spend that you didn't think you'd have to if you have to fix things at that point. And of course, this happens repeatedly. So I was describing, let's say, a series seed that you catch things pretty quickly. But if you didn't even have diligence or was limited, or the scope of diligence was pretty limited at that point, this will come up in your A. If it wasn't caught in the A, you'll catch it in the B. And of course, you're catching everything kind of in between. As investor counsel, when I review documents and diligence, we're definitely looking for things that that were missed in the prior rounds. And so we're really making sure that the cap table is clean and as described to us. And that is, a main source of focus. So I'd say in many instances, well before you get to the exit stage, you'll find out if mistakes were made, hopefully. But certainly some things can come back and bite you later in time. So I'd say I'd put the categories of like main mistakes. I'd say there's two main ones. So the one is sort of equity or equity plus tax is category one, and then IP is category two. And feel free for the rest of the panel to add kind of your big issues. But for us, it's those kind of main buckets. So what you want to make sure you set up properly day one is the equity for the founders. You're getting them very low priced equity. So make sure you haven't accidentally created a company that has a lot of value on day one, because you can't you'd have to pay for that. Otherwise you'd have a taxable event. Make sure that you're implementing vesting between the founder group, because, hey, if someone leaves, they should not be able to walk away with all of their equity. unless they're contributing over time to the company. Make sure you make all of your initial filings, especially an 83B filing with the IRS. Yeah, really, really important. I see you excited there. Dimitri, absolutely a very painful point. So 83Bs is a form that relates to, right, that relates to vesting equity. So typically most founders will get equity that is subject to vesting. They buy it outright, but the company can repurchase it if they leave before the vesting is done. You want to make sure that, so basically you're telling the IRS, hey, tax me today on day one where there's no spread between the price I paid and the value. And so there's no tax then. If you don't file an 83B, basically you're getting taxed as you vest. So each vesting increments, so whether there's a cliff or isn't, but on a monthly basis, you'd be subject to taxation on the spread between the amount you paid and the value at the time of vesting. So you don't want that. You definitely don't want that to happen. And the other important thing to remember is, right, file it within 30 days. I think I see it's in the chat. Super, super important. This is where a lot of mistakes happen. You have to file that 83B within 30 days of buying the stock. So not the day the board approved it, but the day that you paid for the stock typically. If you miss that 30 days, it's an invalid 83B, and then there's some fixing to do. I'm not saying it's not fixable, but it requires some work and effort and money spent to fix it, including removing vesting, for example, and doing some other things that you don't want to do at that point. So make sure you file your 83Bs. This is something that comes up fairly frequently. Most firms, I believe, Org does for sure, help founders in early stage file their 83Bs. Recently had someone show up and say, oh my God, where's my 83B? I don't think I filed it. And we were about to panic before we realized our paralegal filed it. Here's the record. It's all good. Don't worry. But definitely something you don't want to avoid. So that's on equity. I'll actually take this pause here to let other folks react before going into sort of the IP questions. Any questions on here, Hannah, Dimitri, Sona?
Oh yeah, if you don't file the 83B, then the IRS does not have a record for the tax basis for your shares. It also can't effectively tax you on the income. It can there's a lot. It's like a very messy thing if you don't file the 83B. It is recoverable. You can clean it up, but trust me, the cost is not worth it. I think that's really important. I also think that it's a good idea to always review, especially if you're using a service like AngelList or InkNow or whatever, you really want to make sure you review all of the template language that you're getting in your formation documents, so your bylaws, your incorporation docs. One of the things that will often happen is that people will not do that, and then later you have to fix it. So another example, again, personal, I did not know, because it didn't seem to matter at the time, that our shareholder meeting was actually on a very specific day of the year every year, because that's what's in the template of the service that we used. And for the last 4 years, we've technically violated our bylaws by having a shareholder meeting on a different date. And well, nobody cared, and we fixed it. It's been repapered, whatever. But at any time during that year, a shareholder could have brought a lawsuit against the company to say, hey, you're violating your corporate bylaws. And this is the other thing to also consider as you go through this process, is that if you don't, so let's say you do a fundraising round and you don't get all the right consents done because you don't have a good lawyer, and somebody doesn't tell you, hey, you need to file this consent or have this approval or whatever, any shareholder in the future can come back and force you to basically unwind the round. And I mean, I've seen it happen. So I don't know if there's obviously ways to negotiate against it. There's mitigating things you can do, but the consequences of not papering things correctly can be really dire, and it is not worth it. Like if you can't afford the legal to do your job right, you probably shouldn't do the job.
Right. The worst thing is when you have the first time an investor counsel looks at your document and says to you, hey, you've never issued yourself your equity formally. You thought you held stock at this company, but that was never actually done. Board never approved it. And hey, by the way, now you have a term sheet valuing the company at 10 million or 20 million or whatever your first term sheet will be. So not a fun scenario to be up against. Trying to clean it up at that point is not great. So to Dimitri's point, I think getting good counsel on day one is super important. Obviously, I'm biased in saying that, but I do see the pain points, both when companies move over after formation and we have to clean up, and both on the investor side, when we get to sort of doing the due diligence process and we realize these guys could have saved themselves so much time and pain if they had just used good counsel on day one. And again, if you're going with a simple Delaware structure, formation is supposed to be fairly inexpensive at this point. And a lot of firms, including us, will provide deferrals for companies. So we collect the time. There is a dollar amount associated with it, but you don't have to pay it until you fundraise. Basically, that's kind of how the deferral works. And so we recommend if you're serious about forming the company, you're taking yourself seriously, then you should spend the time and effort in getting a good counsel.
It's also just not like, it's hard enough to get your fundraising done based on all the relationship management, selling the vision, proving out traction for early product market fit or later stage traction. It is the worst. It's like one of the worst things to watch that trust erode because buttoning up the little things haven't been done, and you're kind of caught with lack of board consents and messy back end. And it raises eyebrows that make your job even harder for all the other aspects of getting the deal done. And to Dimitri's point, like, you don't want to risk the aspects of letting the deal fully fall apart or be unwound because of this type of exposure. Let's touch very quickly on what you wanted to hit on for the intellectual property, because I think those types of contracts within company formation are critical, but then we will use that to springboard into the financing documents that govern a lot of the actual transactions.
Sure, and I'll cover this very, very quickly, but simply said, day one, you form the company, any IP relating to the company. So you and your co-founder have been sitting in a garage, to be, completely classic about this, for a month or two, thinking about the idea, thinking about what, building out some potential strategies. All of that is already IP, and that it should be owned by the company. So your counsel on day one, when you form the company, will cover assignment of the IP that you created before the formation to the company. And it will also include assignment of any future IP relating to the company's business to the company. If you are a scientist, you work at a university, you have other inventions, you want to exclude those, this is the time to do that, because if it relates to the business, so if you're an AI specialist, for example, or a solar specialist, or in any space, and you have previous IP that you don't intend to assign to the company but relates to the company's business, you definitely need to note that at that time. For the most part, as investors will look at that, they would expect anything in your brain relating to the company to be assigned to the company. To the extent that's not the case, let us know, or let your counsel know, and they will exclude it. But for the most part, that's the case. So there's the IP leading up to the company formation, and then going forward, anything you create relating to the company's business also assigned. There's not a lot of bells and whistles on this. I'll just highlight also, if you are working at a university or a government agency, there are some strings attached to the IP that you may want to assign to the company. So that's something you'll want to, take a look at the university's policies, consult with an IP lawyer, and make sure that, there's a clean chain of the IP ownership into the company. So that's all I'll say, but happy to get your thoughts on that as well.
It's super helpful. And Sonam, I see you want to jump in. I'm coming to you next with questions about, like, how long does that typically take? Like, what are the soft sides of bringing IP into the company at the earliest days?
Yeah, I think on the university side itself, right? So again, universities might own the IP, especially if it was developed by faculty, or you were a student working in a lab for a professor during that time. They may also ask universities, in some cases, also ask for equity in the startup. In that can be anywhere. I've seen 5 to 10%, nothing necessarily beyond that, instead of upfront payments. Again, the alternative is that the spinout might license the technology through an exclusive or non-exclusive agreement. As Yael was mentioning, you've got to sort of come in with a clean slate and have a lot of these discussions ironed out at company formation with the university itself. And keeping all that in mind. You can also sort of push for options for a license structure before securing that funding. That might, you might have, you might ensure that the license fees potentially are deferred until a post Series A, or even in some cases a post Series B, so that you're not, you're avoiding sort of that early cash burden to your business if that's the agreement that you all come to terms with. I think one of the companies that's done this quite well, that I often point to when talking to startups, is Lilac Solutions. They have a lithium extraction technology. They spun out of Northwestern, and they basically negotiated this exclusive license for their core technology, and then used a lot of those provisions and again, right, that core R&D to then go ahead and raise. I think their Series B was $150 million, right, from Lower Carbon and Breakthrough. But they've done that quite well. So that's on the university side. I think one other thing that we were talking about on the prep call for this is actually CVCs, right? And how do you engage corporate venture capital in this process? Either, you may be working at a large company when you're developing these technologies and you might want to spin out, or you might have a CVC on your cap table, going forward. And how do you actually manage that relationship, right? And CVCs in particular are very interested in getting sort of that strategic access to the technology, and that might create IP conflicts for you. Some CVCs I've seen, push for IP sharing clauses that might impact your future licensing, your future M&A prospects. So just think about how involved you want that organization to be and what that looks like. In some cases, you can also what's called field of use rights. So you can grant the CVC as an investor sort of a much narrower field of use for your license without these broad ownership rights. In other cases, you might have sort of these milestone-based collaborations, right? So clear performance milestones that you will get to in partnership with that company before sharing deeper technical details. You might have CVCs who want board seats because of all the IP and things like that, right? That could also potentially create conflicts of interest, especially if they have a competing division within the larger organization. And in those cases, you might want to give them an observer seat instead of voting rights. So again, just a lot of things to keep in mind. Again, another company that's done this well is 12. They have a carbon transformation technology. I think many of you know them. Shell Ventures is one of their largest investors, the CVC arm. But they have a contract that basically limits Shell's influence over the commercial decisions that the company takes. And they've, again, worked with a law firm to actually specifically write out what that looks like.
Thanks for so well articulating.
Oh, go ahead, sorry. I was gonna just address one thing on the company side, which is actually really important. So, I mean, you mentioned it, but I just want to highlight it. One common fact pattern that we see is that, founders are starting to think of an idea, but they haven't left the company that they're currently working for. So maybe they're working for Google, maybe they're working for Meta, could be any one of those, Microsoft, whatever it is. You're still working there, you have this great idea, maybe it relates, maybe it doesn't relate to your day job, but you haven't decided when to press the trigger. And the question of IP is really important in that, or really sensitive in that point in time, because does that IP belong to you because you were thinking about it and now belongs to the new company, new startup you're about to form, or does it belong to Google or Meta or whatever? So that is a really important question, and it also relates, and you want to make sure that there's, again, clean title to your IP, that you can move it out of the company. So generally, you want to make sure you're not working with company resources or on company time while you're developing this IP. So certainly if you do it on the weekends, evenings, and you're using a separate laptop for this, you're probably in a good position to walk away from that IP, to walk away from the company with the IP. But the longer you stay at the company, at Google, while working on something on the side, the riskier it becomes. And some founders will say, well, we'd rather wait till we know we can get fundraising before leaving, before forming a company. But that's like really dangerous territory, right? And typical investors want to see founders who've taken the plunge, who said, we believe in ourselves enough to leave Google and start something, even though we don't know day one that we're about to get funded. We're willing to take that risk to maintain sort of, make sure there's a clean IP title there. And we believe in ourselves enough to do that. And sometimes when you hesitate for too long, that sends a signal. So keep that in mind as well, aside from the IP considerations.
Yeah, anecdotally have literally met founders who have refrained from writing a single line of code in order to keep that division very, very, very clear, especially when what you're building is not as defensible as something that's patented, but is in that kind of software realm in particular. Dimitri, I want to come a bit to you. We've talked a little bit about like graduating from like university spinouts and tech spinouts, spinning out of large companies, to Sonam's point, the graduation of steps and what you might expect as CVCs get more and more interested in maybe some of the hard tech solutions that you're building, how to guard against, their board governance, and that's a great representation of the very early days. Talk to us a little bit, Dimitri, about like the legal considerations and some of the contracts that need to go into place when you are lending or taking money, when you're lending to the companies, taking money from the government or other grants in their capital journey.
Yeah, I mean, I think this boils down to a very kind of simple thing. I think that a lot of founders either over rotate on how much legal diligence they do on a contract, or they under. And I think this, like, we've seen folks who are like, oh, I'm going to have my lawyers review our agreement with Slack. That's not a good use of their time. But, oh, I'm going to do most of the review on our agreement with the government. That's also not a great look, right? And so you kind of have to balance the cost of legal with the risk associated with either not doing it, right? And so I think this guidance is probably true across credit and also equity, right? So in your early days, you're probably raising by a safe. You should just use standard YC paper, and that saves you a ton of legal costs associated with the raise. You still have to paper the board consent. If you need a shareholder consent, there's like other pieces of the legal that you can do, but that way you don't burn a bunch of legal costs on negotiating the actual equity investment agreement when you're raising by a safe. In future rounds, as it gets more complicated, you're going to want to then get legal involved earlier and earlier. But there are points where a lot of the negotiation is commercial. And so you have to decide, okay, the commercial parts will negotiate without lawyers. We'll bring in the lawyers to handle the legal side of it. And if you're not savvy enough to know the difference, you should spend 15 minutes with your attorney prior and be like, hey, where should we use your time? Because if you just go to your lawyer and you're like, hey, here's a term sheet, they're going to do all the work on it. But if you're like, hey, I'm going to negotiate these 10 pieces, I want you to only look at these 3 things, or you told me you only really need to look at these 3 things. It just saves you money, right? And you still get the benefit of their review. When it comes to sort of the work that we do, we are very careful to structure our loan agreements so they don't run afoul of the contracts that we lend against. In fact, we specifically do a thing that a lot of other lenders in our space don't do, which is we don't require assignment of the contract to us as the lender against the contract. A lot of government agencies prohibit assignment of their contract to anyone else. And folks will actually enter into agreements with lenders that technically invalidate their procurement or government grant, which is not the thing you want, right? And so we have structured our loan agreement specifically to avoid all of that. Our relationship is just with the borrower. We do file a lien on the receivables of the contract, but not the contract itself. And those nuances do matter, right? And so I think one of the things that you want to be really careful about is that whenever you're entering into a new agreement with another party, you want to make sure that it has no impact on prior agreements. And so, for example, if you're coming to us as a lender and you sign a term sheet with us, but you have other debt on the books, you should probably understand how that other debt works and really carefully read those agreements, because in some cases, even signing a term sheet with us could be a breach of your loan agreement. And if you're in breach, you're in default and you're going to be in a really tough place, all because you're exploring other credit options. So like, it's really, really important for you to both as a founder, and also maybe this is like a piece of advice that is obvious, but you should never just hand work to your lawyers and be like, it's your job to understand this, it's not my job to understand this. That is a mistake as a founder. What you should do is hand work to lawyers and be like, hey, I need to understand the material risks here. I need to understand what I'm signing. I need to understand how these things play out in different scenarios. And like, your job is to take this complicated thing and translate it for me, and so that I know what I'm actually getting into. And some founders, have spent a lot of time dealing with contracts. Like we don't send a lot of stuff to our lawyers, because most of the stuff we've dealt with 1,000 times before. And so we can like negotiate red line agreements, et cetera. But there's still like, even in those contexts, we will loop in our lawyers and be like, hey, there's this clause, we don't understand how this impacts the business. Can you help us? And so I'll pause there. But I think like the thing that I often see is that people, they don't find that middle ground. They're like either sending everything to their lawyers, in which case their legal bills are like hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, totally unnecessarily, or they don't send enough to their lawyers and then they get caught with their pants down, which is also not a great.
We could probably have an entire other session about the negotiating that goes into like in and around the contracts and the legal agreements themselves. But I cannot emphasize more what Dimitri has said, that like understanding the materiality of the terms that you are negotiating and what is incented by the parties that you're negotiating with is mission critical to getting this done, and using counsel to help translate, well, why does this language represent their risk mitigation, or why does this language represent their potential upside, is really getting to the heart of like, what are you negotiating? That's true of financing, that's true of feedstock agreements, that's true of offtake, that's true of debt and loans. It's across the board. But if you're not managing those negotiations and the fundamentals within a term sheet and a contract as though you're managing a commercial partnership, I think you're missing the point of what the documents represent. And it's easy to, because they end up being 100-page documents that you hear two different legal teams, your counsel and the other counsel. This is also a watch out. Do not let counsel go with counsel without mitigating what is being represented there. So often I see like deals getting done where it's like one counsel is asking for something and the other counsel is not budging, especially in financing agreements for like first price rounds, for example, or large price rounds, or complicated pref stacks, for example. If you are not managing what needs to be done in order to get the deal done, the commercial aspects of the deal, then you're making a mistake and you're probably running up your legal bill way too high and wasting your lawyer's time. Yale, maybe, but I want to talk a little bit about, for this room, I want them to hear from you, like maybe in the broadest strokes, what are the most critical terms that are negotiated within the term sheet and the investment agreements, and how do some of those translate to common pitfalls? Sonam, I'm sure you have a lot of war stories in this as well. But broadly, can you help folks understand the difference between, like, I think the simplest simplification is economics and control. So can you help define what those mean in a term sheet for an early stage financing, and then what you see the implications to be?
And again, this is one of those where we could go on for hours on a lot of this, but we'll try to keep it high level. I do want to say, and touching on this a little bit about and this relates to both what you said, Hannah and Dimitri, about working with your lawyers and really understanding the material. There's a bit of an imbalance of power, maybe a lot of an imbalance of power between the negotiating contracting parties. If you're a first-time founder, especially, you've never looked at these documents before, you've never heard these terms before, and why would you have, right? So it's terms, it's form of art, you've never heard it, but your investor has, and they've done a lot of these deals, and you know, the government has, certainly, your lender has. So everyone has more information than you do. And even if you're a repeat founder, so maybe you've done it too, maybe you've done it 3 times, you're still not, you know, there's still sort of a misalignment of knowledge here. And that's where your lawyer will come in, because actually they do more deals than anyone, right? Because the lawyers on both sides of the deal handle a lot more financings than really anyone else, or a lot more debt transactions, et cetera. So what you want your lawyer to do, to touch on what Dimitri was saying, is explain it to you so you understand what you're agreeing to. And to Hannah's point, don't let your lawyer, you know, make the decision on your behalf. Have your lawyer explain it to you so that you can make that decision, and you can say, hey, you know what, actually, I don't care about this, or hey, actually, this is the thing I really care about, and I'm not going to move forward unless we get this to the right spot, right? So having that dialogue with your counsel is critical. And yeah, you should end up at a spot where you're comfortable on the commercial deal and the governance going forward. So that's just sort of an overview. And don't feel bad asking. No one expects a person who's always, you know, who's been a product, you know, person their entire life to know what anti-dilution is. It's not, you know, it's not instinctual. It's not something you would generally bump into in your day-to-day life. And that's where your VC can speak eloquently about it, but it's important that you hear what that is and how it affects, you know, you and your equity going forward. So what are some of the key items that come up? And I think, Hannah, the way you've structured it sort of between the metrics or the finance numbers and the governance points is a really good way to think about it. So day one, you get a term sheet that could, or not day one, but day one of your financing process. If it's going well, you'll get a term sheet from a VC. It could be as long as 5 to 10 pages, or as short as a half a page. So different investors have different views on this. Some people want to have, you know, everything written out pretty clearly. Others will say, hey, we'll just go with the NVCA standard. So the NVCA, the National Venture Capital Association, has documents on their website that are considered sort of industry standard. I think Hannah posted a link to those there. They are robust. I would not recommend going in and reading them line by line unless you have a lot of time or are having trouble sleeping, because this will put you right out. They are very complex documents, a lot of corporate lingo that you don't have to get into. But generally, the idea is that in some instances, investors will just refer to them and they'll say, well, hey, we'll just go with NVCA standards for most of the rights. Or in other cases, they will really kind of write out explicitly what each right is saying. But let's just say you've gotten a simple term sheet. Number one thing on the term sheet is valuation. Okay, so that's the economics of the deal. So what is the company's valuation? There are multiple ways to get there. You could talk about a pre-money valuation, right? So what is the value of the company today before any money comes in? And there's a post-money, so basically the value today plus the dollars that you expect will be invested. And then there's questions about, well, hey, what's included in a pre-money valuation? What's included in post? So, right, the really important points are, well, how big the investor will say, well, I want pre-money to include a top up to the equity pool, right? And the reason they do that is because increasing the pool ahead of the money coming in only dilutes existing investors and the founders, right? It does not dilute the incoming investors, because it takes that dilution into account pre their investment, right? So generally, investors coming in will designate a certain percentage that they want to see available options to grant to new folks. It typically accounts for hiring that you anticipate to have in the next, 12 to 18, sometimes 24 months, depending on how long that funding is supposed to take you. So, you want to make sure you get a clear picture of what your cap table looks like, pre-money and post-money, with the investment, with the pool increase, with the conversion of all the convertible securities like notes and safes and warrants and other things. So the best way to get a clear picture of what does this valuation and what does this pool size mean for me is to look at a pro forma cap table, basically a modeling of the capital structure at taking the financing into account. And typically, once you get a term sheet, you share that with your lawyer, and your lawyer will send you a pro forma to look at so that you can understand, what does this mean to my equity as a founder? How much does this dilute me? I know I like the top line, hey, I like this $50 million number that someone threw at me, right? But what if that's 50 million plus the money, right? Now is that 40 million? What about the dilution from the pool? So kind of understanding all of that, where does that leave you? Super important to understand. That's the top line of your any term sheet that you look at. I'll take a quick pause because I've said a lot, just to allow guys to address this point, because I know it's critical.
At the end of the day, economics is about who owns how much of the company, right? It's about fully diluted, what percentage do you own? And there are many terms, and we've linked to a couple resources that can help you get to them. I think Yale eloquently described the most important of those dynamics and how to leverage your lawyer to get those answers through this tool, which is called a pro forma cap table. It's just a fancy Excel sheet with a couple of formulas. It's not rocket science. It takes me 20 minutes. It probably takes Sonam 10. And so it's one of those things that you can teach yourself and leverage your lawyer to help you understand its intricacies. Sonam, do you want to tackle a little bit of like what you as an investor look for when negotiating term sheets about control? Like, talk to us a little bit in the early stages, not only how it gets papered and documented in the terms, but like what are your investors looking for? What should founders be looking for in the, through the Series A, essentially?
Yeah, I think so much of it is also thinking about who you actually want on your cap table, right? And what value they will provide, and then how that is then translated into the legal documents that Yale or any lawyer will actually draft for you. I think one of the first things is, do you or do you not want this person or this firm as a part of your board, right? And these discussions usually come to light often at seed stage, in some cases at Series A, depending on sort of the type of company you have. You will want either your lead investor or someone on your cap table to provide you strategic value to actually help your company grow. You will want to give that person a board seat, because they are then, as an investor, I am like very incentivized, right, to help you succeed and scale, because not only do I own a portion of your company, but this is my value add to you as a business, to help you grow. We have seen a number of instances where, for us, we might not come in as the biggest check, but as a firm, we have like an urban deployment network, right? And as I was talking about earlier, we often partner with cities, with real estate groups, with infrastructure groups. If you're a built environment company, creating some sort of buildings technology, you probably want us to make a lot of introductions for you to our network, right? So that you can actually scale your company, and we would want something in return for that. That can show up again as a board seat. I would also, as you're negotiating all of this, think about pro rata rights and what those look like, and who you're giving those to as a part of your cap table, and what implications that will have on your next raise. We just went through a situation where one of our companies, is doing extremely well. They basically got preempted with a really healthy valuation from a large investor. And the large investor basically wanted to take the entire round, but us as early stage investors had put into the documents that we all have pro rata rights, right? So it's a touchy sort of conversation to some extent with the founder, right? But it's, again, proving your value and why it's worth for them to dilute themselves just a little bit, so that we can continue to have that good relationship and be supportive. All of those things that come to light as you're going through these negotiations, and as you're actually on the fundraising journey, because again, it's not just about money, but it's also about what value the investor can provide.
I think one thing oh, sorry, go ahead.
I would also, we should come back to this, but there, a lot of you will have grants or have utilized grants as a part of your capital stack. That often also comes up for us in a lot of these negotiations. And would love to just touch on that after, as a part of the discussion after this.
I think one thing I'll add here is that just sometimes what happens when you're negotiating things, this is less legal, more commercial, but sometimes what ends up happening is that folks can't get aligned on either the dollar amount, the pro rata, whatever, some commercial term. And it's hard to let go as a founder. And so you will have the instinct to get creative. You're like, oh, well, I can't get the evaluation I want. Why don't we add some warrants so that you can get a sweetener, but like actually the price we want is the price we want. I'm not going to ever tell people not to get creative with their financing. I think like you should do what you want to do to make sure that your business gets funded the way you want, but just be mindful that it has downstream implications. And the more creative you get with the structure of a round, likely the more painful the next round will be. And you have to keep that in mind when you make these decisions. And there are ways to work around it. So, I think like one of the most common things is that you want a different price for your price round because you have a bunch of equity converting, but the investor doesn't want to pay it. And so you give them warrants to get them to the number that they want. And this can then piss off a bunch of your investors because you're now converting folks at a price, even though actually it's not the price. But it can also then mess up your cap table because now you have a bunch of warrants on your cap table. And so if you go into that process knowing that that is a consequence, you can then manage it effectively. You can communicate with investors effectively. You might spread the warrants around. You might have a threshold for warrants. There's lots of different ways to work around it. And this is where really good attorneys come into play because they can advise you on how they've seen other clients do this, where the pain is less painful. There will be pain if you get creative. The question is, how painful does it need to be? And I think like, yeah, I would just, this is where like really good legal can play a big role.
Yeah, and there's definitely also signaling to like special structures. Investors are repeat players. When they come in on a round and they look back at the last round and there's some weird structuring or, weird warrants or all kinds of things, there's sort of a question that comes up in their minds, like what actually happened there? Did they not believe in the valuation? Did they not believe in the company? What was happening? So that signaling is also something you want to keep in mind.
I love that framing. Venture investors are repeat players. And I think a lot of the concepts in your financing documents that you should be very aware of is what precedent you're setting. Every round almost always builds on the last round. And so for as much as you can keep things vanilla, standard, even like pari passu, where your investors are kind of all in the same preferred equity class, and you can keep that for as long as possible, it only helps you build structure in the future when you really need that structure. And that structure refers here to the like creative footwork that helps you get something done in like warrants or, different share classes. And that is, you really want to keep that as a secret weapon, like when you need it to get the deal done, when you're using it to isolate risk for a certain investor and get them across the line when it's existential for your company. For as much as you can keep your precedent like vanilla out of the gates and for as long as possible, it only helps you go further and faster in that way. And using counsel to lend you credibility to say like, well, the last 8 seed deals at this, dollar range in these valuation ranges looked like this. Like that's a type of pattern recognition and matching that good counsel who work in your space can bring to the table for you, not because it gives you negotiating leverage exclusively, but because it helps inform what you're doing, and gives you the confidence. I would say from here, let's talk a little bit about like you know, the tactics, Yael, about engaging your lawyer. Like how frequently are you touching base with you know, folks when you're engaging, you know, through these financing rounds? How do you like people to approach you? What are some of the watch outs or the, like, you know, don'ts when it comes to keeping your lawyer like happy and also, you know, like in a well-oiled work stream to do what you need to do effectively when talking about financings?
I think it's a great question. So I'll start and say this. Generally, as lawyers, we want you to succeed, right? And you should only work with lawyers who want you to succeed. And so I view the relationship, you know, as sort of a team or group. We're working together with the same goal. If you do well, we do well. It's, you know, it's symbiotic in that way. So when we think about working effectively, I know Dimitri touched a lot on the pain point of maybe using your lawyer too much or too little, definitely an issue. But the too much concern is, you know, if you ask us to do something, we want to do a good job for you. If you ask us a broad question, we want to get you the right answer. We're required to give you the right answer, right? But we also don't want to see you sad or upset when you go back and you look at your legal bills and you're like, I don't understand how this happened, or why am I required to pay thousands of dollars when we really just wanted to do a good job and get you what you needed, right? So basically what we want to avoid is that miscommunication. So talking to your lawyer often, discussing kind of the scope of the work that you need, whether it's just, you know, is it just a high level, you know, flag for me the biggest issues that can come up in this agreement, or I actually want you to mark this up right now and tell me, you know, tell me everything that's wrong with it. Having that continuous conversation is really, really important and will lead to kind of both your success and your lawyer's success in not disappointing you on the fees or on the quality of the work. So I would say a good relationship between a lawyer and the founding team or any client really is that of sort of a continuous discussion on the scope and the timing and what are the goals that you're trying to achieve. I recommend starting, you know, finding a person that's, you know, there are a lot of good firms. Certainly there's a lot of good lawyers out there. Finding someone that you connect with that understands your industry, finding someone who you think you can call in the middle of the night and they'll take your call, someone who will prioritize you, right? Someone whose advice you trust and is really invested in making sure that you know, this company succeeds. So those are some of the guidelines. The sooner you can get that person on board, the better, to avoid some of the pitfalls we discussed in the beginning. But sometimes you get going and you realize, hey, I'm not getting the kind of attention that I need. You know, they're not I don't understand what they're saying. They're not answering the questions, or I didn't like the style generally of this person I'm working with. It's not a big issue to make a switch and go to another law firm. Find a person that you connect with and you can trust. And that work of transferring from one to another is not very complex. So I recommend doing that because you really do. The last thing you want to have to worry about is, you know, not being able to trust the attorney that you work with and not having a good relationship. So it's super, super important that you find the right person.
I would add, I think like, I think that most attorneys have pretty good incentive alignment with you, but sometimes those can get a little, those can drift apart, especially when it comes to how billables are handled, right? So in some firms, they want to put as many people in the room as possible, bill as many hours as possible. Other firms will be more mindful of it. I think it's actually on the founder or the CEO to really manage that process. And I think one of the things that has helped a lot for us as we've worked with probably 4 or 5 law firms throughout the time that we built Enduring Planet. We have 3 active firms that we work with at any given time because they handle different aspects of our business. And what we found that's really helpful is one, really establishing the like how it works, how the relationship will work upfront, and saying, look, like this is what I want. This is what I want to pay for. This is how I want the relationship to work. And if your attorney's like, great, that is also how we work, then awesome. If they're like, well, then like it's worth interrogating whether or not they're the right firm for you. And then the other thing that I found works really well is it's often way more efficient to have a 15-minute call with a partner than to send an email with a bunch of attachments and be like, hey, give me your opinion on this. And sometimes that will still be required. But at least what you can do is in that 15-minute call, you can establish exactly what needs to be shared, what needs to be reviewed. You can avoid the risk that someone takes a question and misunderstands what you want and does a lot more work than you actually need, which has happened to us. So like at one point, we emailed one of our firms and we said, hey, we have this question. And it turned into $20,000 worth of work before we really understood what had happened. And so 15-minute phone calls are the best way to do it. You send your lawyer your Calendly, you're like, here's a 15-minute block, you pick. And, or like, here's a window, and you just have to keep it really tight. And I think that has worked really well for me and for us as we engage lawyers across all sorts of very complicated things. I don't know, Sonam, I imagine you have lots of ideas about this as
I
well.
mean, we as a venture fund, we also have to pay for lawyers, right? I feel like everybody in this room has to. And I think one thing that we've done just personally is that, you know, if we have sort of this vague general question, you have all the docs with you, right? You can actually use ChatGPT, use some of these resources, right, that are free for you to get yourself educated, and then have that 15-minute phone call so that you actually know what things to ask for, what things to highlight as a part of that conversation, and make that discussion much more efficient for everybody involved. The second thing that we personally do, and that we also encourage all of our portfolio companies to do, is to think about the hierarchy of that law firm, right? If it's pretty simple work, you need to sort of, you know, review simple docs. I agree, don't trust LLMs or legal advice, but this is, again, to get yourself educated. But what I was saying was that legal firms often have, you know, paralegals that can help with some of the minutia of doc review. Go and use those resources first. You might have a junior person on your team that might be able to do that as well, from the law firm side, and then have that, you know, conversation that's more strategic with the partner. So just like any organization, be mindful of how much of each of these different sort of layers cost, right? And try to form your asks as such.
Yeah, I think one thing I'll add on that front is that founders will often mistake. They'll look at the price sheet for a law firm and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to go to the associate with this question because I want it to cost me less. The problem is that oftentimes you end up with this sort of in the background, the associate has to go ask the partner bills hours, and the partner has to review. Sometimes it's actually cheaper just to work directly with the partner. And so this is a thing that is, as part of your sort of operating model with a firm, you want to sit down with them and be like, hey, as stuff comes up, who should I be reaching out to? Who does triage? Do you bill for triage? Like one of the firms we work with, one of the managing partners does all the triage. He does not bill for that time.
Right, and just to clarify what triage means is there's a lot of legal needs you might have at a single time. Some of them are corporate on the financing, some are IP related, some are equity, employment, litigation. So typically you'll have one partner that you connect with, typically a corporate person. That person is, you know, triaging for you who is the right person within, you know, this large organization that is a firm that is the right person to speak to you about this. So yeah, typically a partner should not be billing you for time deciding who is the right person at the firm and educating that person. So let's say it's an employment question, right? That comes up. So making sure so getting the right employment partner or employment associate in the loop should not cost you money just for that. But looping you in with that person, you will then have a conversation with that employment specialist, for example, and then that conversation will likely cost money, but it's most likely that on the back side that the partner has already given sort of general context about the company and the work that the firm has been doing for this company before you even have that initial conversation with the employment specialist or any other specialist at the firm.
Yeah. Oh, this was incredibly helpful. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Dimitri, Yael, Sonam. This has been awesome. I think there's so many more questions that have come through the chat and that I know these founders are sitting on when it comes to the full scope of how to keep contracts and agreements coming across financing and into the later stages of customers and bringing them in. I think what you're hearing is like good contracts represent good deals, right? And you need good counsel to get to the heart of like, what are you actually asking for and giving in the nature of those contracts. But in some essence, as you grow, part of the way that you demonstrate de-risking of all of your different relationships, whether that's your corporate kind of buttoned up structuring, whether that's your relationship with your investors and the board, whether that's your relationships with your employees, whether that's your relationships with customers and suppliers, and how to attract lenders to the tax equity that you've ultimately been promised, turning those promises and the commercial momentum into contracts, even if it's LOIs and MOUs and then things like offtake agreements and feedstock agreements, or, you know, true partnerships. All of that is done by getting good counsel behind good contracts along the way. So thanks everyone for participating here. Thanks to our speakers especially. We totally look forward to all of the feedback to come.
And we will publish a summary in written format, and also we'll publish the video. So stay tuned for that. And we'll see folks who are able to join us at San Francisco Climate Week. We'll see you in San Francisco. And otherwise, stay tuned for our May session on folk financing, which is going to be a good one. So thanks, everyone.
Sweet.
Take care, y'all.
Thanks, folks.